Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents An Iron Wind, Europe Under Hitler, by Peter Fritzsche, narrated by Runnette. Introduction. Stalingrad's World War II memorial is inscribed with the words, "An iron wind beat into their faces," followed by, "But they all kept marching on." For German-occupied Europe, the first part is true. The second part is not. The war was an iron wind, massively and unrelentingly destructive on the home front as well as the battlefield. But not everyone marched. People were deported, enslaved, and massacred. Others crouched down to find shelter from the wind of war, or they turned with the wind to collaborate or somehow make do. Those who did fight did not always do so from the war's beginning, or find themselves alive at its end. This book is about how people scattered by the iron wind of Germany's war in Europe in the years 1939 to 1945 came to intellectual grips with the most terrible conflict in modern history. When World War II came, it smashed through the expectations about battle that had been formed during the Great War that preceded it. The war marched into civilian lives in an unprecedented way. Not only were cities bombed, but homes invaded, neighbors arrested, and Jews deported. The iron wind also unsettled and then blew apart notions of empathy and solidarity. In no previous modern war was the casualty rate among civilians so high and suspicion about neighbors so acute. In dramatic contrast to the fallen uniformed soldiers mourned after World War I, the vast majority of the dead in World War II were non-combatant men, women, and children, some 20 million in all. Nearly 1 million civilians died in aerial bombardments, with tens of millions more left homeless. But the air war's casualties were not nearly as high as Europeans anticipated at the outbreak of the war. Instead, thousands upon thousands of civilians were slaughtered as hostages, as Germany retaliated against partisan attacks on its soldiers, or were killed simply for being Polish or Jewish. Nearly 1 out of every 5 Poles perished during the conflict, in contrast to 1 in 50 who did so in France. 3/4 of Europe's Jews, a total of 6 million people, did not survive. They were the neighbors most likely to be deported and murdered. The war turned military barracks, such as those in Theresienstadt and Auschwitz, into civilian concentration camps. It is imperative to reconsider World War II not simply as a military conflict, but as an extraordinary assault on civilians. World War II's home front was the setting for what was new and most shocking about the war. Trouble in the streets, noises in the stairwell, and wartime curfews meant that people stayed at home for longer periods of time, at least until they were forced to leave. It was in their rooms that observers tried to figure out what was going on, where they looked out of windows, explored labyrinths of the heart, and pierced thoughts into philosophy. People sought to make sense of the war and the new circumstances it imposed. Words gained new meanings in the violence, even as they lost much of their ability to communicate events. Speakers and listeners, texts and contexts were torn from familiar moorings by the iron wind. The words people spoke and wrote reveal the labor of comprehension and the struggle for meaning in World War II. War in the 20th century ripped apart assumptions about progress and civilization. The Great War in 1914 to 1918, a war that was great because it was so murderous and long, exposed basic failings in major social institutions, which often proved themselves to be inept, inflexible, and unaccountable. In contrast, individual men and women emerged from the war abused, victimized, but still very much human. The cynicism of the interwar years thus targeted parliamentary leaders and their patriotic speeches, business executives and their profiteering, and military strategists and their misguided directives, but not the soldiers who had fought and sacrificed in the trenches. World War II exposed something else. The drama of the war was found not in a contemptible betrayal of the front by the rear, but in the betrayals that characterized civilians at home. In Europe, the war was first and foremost a regime of German occupation, bracketed by often quite rapid military engagements at the beginning and the end. During the occupation, neighbors often divided on basic political issues regarding Germany's war aims and the durability of the new order it sought to impose on the continent. Some people collaborated, others resisted, but most wavered in a moral no-man's land between the two positions. Opportunism and greed motivated civilians, fear paralyzed them, and disregard for others blinded them. The war erased whole horizons of empathy as people crouched within their own little worlds of tenuous security. Neighbors failed one another. The terms Jew and Aryan quickly became part of everyday speech, widening the gulf between the two groups, who experienced very different wars. Patriots and resistors did rally against the Germans, but the patriotic narratives they embraced became much more ethnically and religiously homogeneous. In some, the war made men and women look smaller. They were easily misled, apt to be envious, mistrustful, and indifferent to the fate of others, particularly Jews, and more often than not accommodated themselves with surprising ease to circumstances in which they simply struggled to survive. At the heart of the war was the experience of civilians who suffered and who aggravated suffering in extraordinary ways. War has often been compared to a plague that sweeps through a population, a natural catastrophe that suddenly destroys everyday routines, or a weather front that darkens the skies. These images aptly convey how war affected everything in daily life, but they fail to account for the part that civilians played in the disaster and the far-reaching consequences of their interpretations and responses. An Iron Wind explores the lessons civilians learned as they learned the war. It follows the conversations by which people comprehended the war as it unfolded and the sightlines by which they witnessed the depredations occurring around them. While most accounts of German-occupied Europe examine German policies and the pathways people took to collaboration and resistance, this book expands the focus to investigate what people thought about themselves, about the violence the Germans meted out, and the indifference the violence prompted, as well as the explanations proffered to understand its proliferation into all the corners of daily life. The chapters that follow are ultimately about how neighbors, people who were likely to meet and share common spaces, looked at themselves in conditions of extreme violence. The self-examination demanded by the war revealed new creatures, some of them sympathetic, many of them loathsome. Because the Nazi assault on Europe's Jews occurred in plain view of millions of people but was not properly seen or understood at the time, the Holocaust is central to appreciating how the home front responded to and was marked by extreme violence. Examining how occupied Europe made sense of World War II is essential to understanding what became of men and women in a war that was very much directed at civilians and civilian society. The Iron Wind dispersed people, uprooted them, and forced them to rally to new lines of defense. It also rearranged the words they used to make sense of the turbulence going on around them. Words consoled, but they also misled, and they often proved insufficient to provide a full understanding of the German assault. This inadequacy was part of the devastation of the war. These words in destruction often misrepresented the horrors of war, justified them, yet ultimately, in however insufficient a way, they also witnessed and narrated them. If read carefully, the incomplete and inadequate descriptions of the war that survive offer unparalleled insights into the everyday experience of the war, conveying the mixture of illusion, hope, anguish, and indifference that it prompted. The inscription at Stalingrad, describing an iron wind, is a perfect example of how words, in this case composed in 1967, could both distort the record of the war, which did not provide evidence for massive collective resistance, and contribute to that record by offering a rallying myth for those who did resist. Words like "an iron wind" tell us something about the frightening nature of the conflict, the problems inherent in fully and accurately understanding it, and people's great eagerness to find narrative forms that would create meaning and enable the remembrance of suffering and sacrifice. Ordinary people undertook a great deal of intellectual work to understand the war. Mostly they talked. There was endless talk about the war, the aims of the Nazis and their relationship to the German people as a whole, the possibility of the war expanding over time and through space, and, of course, the prospects for a final victory. It consumed families over the rationed courses of dinner. It preoccupied shoppers standing in long lines curling out of the butchers or bakers, and it furnished rumors and jokes to travelers on railway journeys. At home, people took up ambitious reading programs that gave books such as Tolstoy's War and Peace unprecedented popularity, even as the large shelf of volumes on soldiers fighting World War I remained largely untouched. Victorious German soldiers pasted together commemorative photo albums right up until the point when they started to retreat. Indeed, much of the documentary evidence about the Holocaust comes from amateur photographers in the ranks of the German military. Millions and millions of pieces of mail were sent to and from the military fronts. Battlefields were littered with the letters and notebooks that fallen soldiers had stuffed into their gear. Along the railroad tracks, carrying the freight cars of deported Jews, passers-by sometimes picked up and even posted crumpled letters that had been thrown through the cracks. Across Europe, diarists recorded the conversations and rumors they heard and the impressions they gathered. Especially in the Polish ghettos, into which the Germans herded local Jews, everyone seemed to keep a diary. An astonishing number of these survived, since great care was taken not only to bear witness, but also to preserve the text of witnessing. Indeed, many of the diaries that cover the year 1939 to 1945 were begun with the explicit intention to leave a record of wartime experience. War-generated copy. Most of these personal papers have not previously been used in a critical or central way to tell the story of the war. Witnesses wrote with a mixture of confusion and confidence, and both attitudes shaped ordinary people's wartime experience and contributed to their ability to understand and act. In Jewish ghettos, for example, diarists trembled as they set pen to paper. They anguished over whether words existed to convey the terrifying realities unfolding around them, and they worried about the capacity of readers after the war to believe or comprehend the narratives they left behind. Sometimes they stopped writing because they were paralyzed or dispirited. At the same time, they could write only because they had some confidence that they were communicating with future readers. Diarists who recorded Germany's implementation of the final solution contemplated the possibility that their experience would be forgotten entirely. But they nevertheless turned the page, because they believed there was a reasonable chance that their lives and their sufferings might be recognized and incorporated into a different kind of post-war history. Confusion created insight regarding the power and frailty of words, and provided a glimpse into despair and fright. Confidence depended in large measure on worn cliches, consoling precedents, and conventional narratives that generated hope, but did not always shed light. Germans often wrote with great confidence about the epic nature of the victories they had achieved, but the stories they told also betrayed confusion and bewilderment about the losses those victories required. Likewise, in France and Poland, witnesses watched the actions of their neighbors and had to guess at their motives and weigh their own. They asked themselves about the extent of collaboration with or resistance to the German occupiers, and the depth of even their own anti-Semitism. Yet the citizens of the occupied nations also consoled themselves with tight patriotic narratives that obscured unwelcome or confusing evidence of complicity in German policies. It is precisely the everyday work of mulling over, but also denying, unwelcome truths about collaboration and anti-Semitism in conversations, diaries, and letters that makes wartime talk such a rich source for understanding people's experience in German-occupied Europe. An Iron Wind is organized around a series of contrasting perspectives. At every step, I analyze how different perspectives influence the choices civilians make, showing both how the experience of war shaped the record of war and how the record shaped the experience. I begin with Europeans contemplating war in 1938, the year when most everybody expected the outbreak of a high-tech air war, contrasting the great debate about intervention and Hitler's intentions with the actual racial war that ultimately unfolded. This picture of before and after indicates how thoroughly Europeans could misunderstand German intentions in World War II, and how they could mistake Hitler's principal victims, European Jews, for intemperate warmongers. I use Paris and Warsaw, the two largest cities occupied by the Germans, to provide different perspectives on the occupation and civilian responses to it. Paris became more like Warsaw over time, but the Germans consistently acted with more thorough brutality in Warsaw, which was basically leveled at the end of the war, than in Paris, which was not. I also compare how Jews in Paris and Warsaw and elsewhere perceived the war, and were perceived in the war by their fellow citizens. It becomes very clear that across Europe there was both a Jewish and a non-Jewish war zone, which were separate in crucial ways despite overlapping in time and space. The erection of this mental border was one grim achievement of the German occupation. It cleared the path to genocide, but also had the deleterious effect of forcing Jews themselves to make distinctions between those they believed could be saved and those who could not. Living with these borders, people across Europe accepted the proposition that their own survival depended in large part on the death sentences meted out to others. Finally, I have used the somewhat unusual example of Switzerland to draw out discussions about the promise and the limits of the new order that the victorious Third Reich represented, and the startling frankness with which Germans justified the violence that the new order entailed. In many ways, the Swiss were cousins to the Germans, at once intimate and distant enough to consider seriously the appeal of Nazism and to prod the Nazis to explain themselves. Swiss witnesses thereby recorded the voices of German perpetrators. While an Iron Wind spotlights civilians, it also examines the uniformed German soldiers who menaced them. Focusing on French, Polish, Jewish, German, and Swiss witnesses leaves a great deal out, since the Germans occupied much more of Europe, creating extraordinary devastation in the Soviet Union, and relying on client states such as Hungary, Italy, and Croatia to pursue their ambitious continental policies. But Paris and Warsaw provide illuminating perspectives on the overall contours of civilian experience during World War II, and on the effort to comprehend the war, from the most basic outlines of the conflict to its deepest implications regarding the nature of God, divine justice, the scope of humanity, and the adequacy of testimony. Using the ordinary documents that observers created for themselves, I have tried to listen and to analyze how people made sense of the deadliest war in modern times. The dilemmas of choice, responsibility, and witnessing that World War II exposed still structure the intellectual world we live in today. In the most dramatic way, the war posed existential questions about the solidarities among men and women, the human capacity to accept evil, the existence of God, and the shortcomings of witnessing, many of the elements that make up our own postmodern sensibility. Whenever we return to the terrible years 1939 to 1945, we are forced to wonder what it is that makes us human and frail. Chapter 1. Talk in Wartime. English writer Leonard Woolf described the experience of the new war as something like endlessly waiting in a dirty, gray railway station waiting room with nothing to do but wait endlessly for the next catastrophe. Woolf's repetition, waiting, waiting, wait, suggests his sense of complete arrest. Woolf's anticipation and apprehension were rooted in his keen understanding of the terrible difference between August 1914, when ideas of armed conflict remained wrongly scaled to events that had occurred at Austerlitz and Waterloo 100 years earlier, and September 1939, when, as a result of the War of 1914 to 1918, people now knew exactly the horrors of death and destruction, wounds and pain and bereavement and brutality. Across Europe, when war was declared in 1939 for the second time in a lifetime, there was no sign of the light-hearted, celebratory mood that had rushed over the capital cities 25 years earlier. Families still grieved for sons and brothers and fathers who had fallen in the Great War. You could see men missing legs or arms walk across all scenes of everyday life. Now the next trainload of events was rolling into the station. Woolf's exactly bespoke his expectation of terrible things oncoming. Call-up orders, memorized song, pale lies, casualty lists, tear-streaked faces. But in fact, the Great War did not furnish exact knowledge about the next, much greater war that was on its way. The difference between August 1914 and September 1939 was not just better knowledge of the costs of war. The new conflict appeared more omnivorous because it was poised to destroy homes and neighborhoods, not just soldiers on the front. In September 1939, civilians thought not only about loved ones in uniform, but also about themselves. Writer Virginia Woolf, Leonard's wife, remarked on the domestic state of the emergency, describing heaps of sandbags in the streets, men digging trenches in the parks, lorries delivering planks on corners. Indeed, in the fall of 1940, the Woolfs lost their home in London in an aerial bombardment, and they continued to be menaced by the wail of the sirens and the drone of the German planes flying in from the sea after they had retreated to the country in Sussex. Not least because she feared that German soldiers would follow German airplanes, Virginia Woolf committed suicide at the end of March 1941. What was different about World War II was that war came in from the sea, across the borders that separated the battlefront from the home front, that it swept into domestic lives, and that it kept coming, as one danger waved in the next. The sense of being assaulted, but not knowing when the next catastrophe would come or from where, created the feeling of being stuck in a railway station waiting room. The wait was not only endless, but all-enveloping. It was a new sort of self-consciousness. The war threatened to become all you know. Virginia Woolf herself had for a long time tried to stay clear of the waiting room, remaining an outsider to the war. Who could care one straw, she asked in 1938, about a future war? We know winning means nothing. But when air war did come from across the Channel, it spread like a terrible disease. Suddenly the outsider was inside. Woolf wrote about our wounded, our men, our majestic city. She soon felt trapped inside. After the defeat of France in June 1940, she wrote, "We're fighting alone with our back to the wall." In the uncertain wait for the next catastrophe, wartime stretched out the present moment so very far that it felt like an eternity. Time since the armistice between France and Germany in June 1940, remarked writer Léon Vert, this time from Lyon in 1941, has not been real time. It has simply been a time of waiting. Using the same metaphor as Leonard Woolf, he wrote, "We can classify it as the category of time which one spends in a train station waiting for a train. It was a time that both annihilated and stayed, cutting away the past, postponing the future, and elongating the present amid an unceasing barrage of events. And as in any railway station waiting room, the stranded travelers read timetables, they reread bulletins, they peered down the tracks, and they talked constantly among themselves about the next train. They waited for the wail of the siren, anticipated the drone of the bomber, and wondered whether soldiers would invade. In World War II, the waiting and waiting room chatter went on and on. The stretched-out present was time without a frame, terrain without a horizon. Normal timetables no longer applied. In Dresden, Victor Klemperer, a professor of literature and a German Jew who was protected by his marriage to a Catholic, waited for some sort of conclusion, not so much a sign on the horizon as a sign of the horizon. Surely the terrible laws in September 1941 requiring Jews to wear yellow stars represented the final act. His friend Missy Meyerhoff, writing from Berlin, argued, "I too believe it is the fifth act." Klemperer agreed. But unlike Shakespeare's plays, he noted, some plays in world literature, for example Hugo's Cromwell, have 6 acts. Would there be another catastrophe after the starred decree? In Paris, a year later, in July 1942, another student of literature, Hélène Baer, herself already wearing the yellow Jewish star, suspected that something is brewing. She figured that the next catastrophe would certainly be a tragedy for fellow Jews, but she did not know whether it would be the tragedy. Would the fifth act be the final act? And would the final act bring an end to the war, or would it bring an end to the travelers in the railway station waiting room? This confusion was the condition of endlessly waiting for the next catastrophe. Contemporaries such as Leonard Woolf, Leon Werth, Victor Klemperer, and Hélène Baer talked without end about the end of the war, and they searched for signs, the vox populi, in Klemperer's words, that might help them reach some sort of conclusion. However, what they found were often voces populi, a confusing array of contradictory data. Very little was predictable or certain. The first season of the war, in the autumn of 1939, was quickly designated as the phony war because the expected air bombardment of London, Paris, and Berlin failed to materialize. The fall of France to Germany in June 1940 was supposed by many to end in a scenario in which Britain would be knocked out of the war. But this did not happen either. Germany's blitzkrieg offenses against the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, and again a year later, ended neither in defeat nor in victory. The dramatic events of the year 1943, after Germany suffered huge losses at Stalingrad and Italy turned against its coalition partner, did not bring about Germany's capitulation, as many observers had assumed. What is more, the Allies did not open a second front in 1942 or 1943, as promised. And when it did come at last, in June 1944, with the invasion of Normandy, predictions by military commanders that Germany would surrender by Christmas proved to be wrong. Logistical planning in the Second World War was a nightmare, concludes one historian. This nightmare had the effect of making talk in wartime more animated, more obsessive, and more inconclusive. Woolf's railway station image is especially apt because opinions about the next catastrophe were frequently expressed in actual train stations and on trains. Trains and stations were places where one was likely to have time on one's hands, to meet strangers who might have heard something new, and to pick up threads of wartime talk. One could literally take a train between 1939 to 1945, whether it was an express from Warsaw, a local out of Bourg, a German army transport to Dnipropetrovsk in Ukraine, or a tram around Amsterdam, and hear constant chatter about the war, the summer offensive, the Second Front, and the end of the war, food shortages, the black market and the cold of winter, the depredations of soldiers and the deportation of Jews. Trains, train stations, and waiting rooms were garrulous spaces, and diarists often read the signs of the war, by reporting on conversations among travelers. Other public space.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?